Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. I want to thank you all for joining us today. As always, we hope that you'll find this presentation both informative and relevant, and that you'll take away knowledge that you can apply to your organization. This is the last installment in our 5-part webinar series hosted by Innovus and Oracle. We've been discussing topics that encompass evolution of planning and budgeting, focusing on pain points organizations and particularly planners face when managing their periodic planning cycle. Today's topic will revolve around valid planning intersections. Today's presentation will be broken down into 4 parts. There'll be a brief introduction of Innovus and our speakers. We will then walk you through a brief overview of valid planning intersections. Krishna will deliver a live demonstration. And finally, we'll have some time for Q&A. As always, please make sure to submit your questions via the chat window throughout the presentation. We may address some questions throughout the webinar, and others we'll make sure to address at the end. I want to spend a moment talking about Innovus and who we are. Innovus is a full-service provider of consulting services leveraging the Oracle EPM product stack. We have been an Oracle partner since 2012 and are recognized as a cloud excellence implementer using the Oracle EPM Cloud products. All of our resources work closely with both users and Oracle product development to ensure our clients leverage the full feature set of the Oracle EPM Cloud to get the highest return on their investment. Ultimately, we're striving to be that trusted advisor to our clients to help realize their vision of performance management and business analytics. We work exclusively with Oracle products, and we are fully capable of delivering demonstrations for all of the business processes in the Oracle EPM Cloud stack. Once again, I'm Gary Soreo, Vice President in charge of project delivery at Innovus. I personally have been working in consulting for the EPM BI space for the better part of the last 10 years. I started on the client side, moved on to consulting with EPM in 2012, which is when I joined Innovus, and since then I've been working closely with our team to become a successful EPM implementer and a trusted advisor to our clients. I would now like to give Krishna the opportunity to introduce herself. Krishna?
Thanks, Gary. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Krishna Marur. I have over 17 years of experience with EPM, BI, and data warehousing. And I'm a consultant at Innovus. Sorry. I'll be doing the demo today. Back to you, Gary.
Thanks, Krishna. Just to reiterate, this is the last installment in our 5-part series. We will be hosting an additional webinar on Friday, June 26th, and that will cover sandboxes in EPM Cloud Planning and Budgeting. We will include the information about our June 26th webinar in the email that we will be sharing on Monday, which will include a link to the recording of this webinar on our website, and all registrants will receive that link through email. Now to talk a little bit about planning intersections. Valid intersections help to maintain data integrity of your business's plan and forecast data. What valid intersections do is they allow you to go beyond the security limitations of just regular old planning dimension security, and they allow you to achieve cross-dimensional security with ease. They allow updates through cross-module integration, which we would refer to as data maps, while disabling direct data entry. So for example, you have the ability to move data from an underlying workforce module to a consolidated financial planning module without worrying about users overriding the data that's been moved. They also allow you to filter member intersections in runtime prompts for more efficient calculation of the data. With that, I'm going to hand it off to Krishna to kind of take it away. So Krishna, if you want to talk a little bit more about valid intersections and then move into the live demo. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Gary. Okay, so valid intersections in EPBCS. So they can be defined as groups and rules within various groups. We will look at how to create a group versus multiple rules in a group. So when you create a valid intersection, you have to select one dimension as an anchor dimension, which is a required dimension. So you can have more than one dimension, but one dimension should be your anchor and only one can be the anchor dimension. All other dimensions in your valid intersections are considered non-anchor dimensions. We will take a look at a few examples as to what an anchor dimension is, what role it plays, and what happens when you actually choose a certain anchor dimension versus another. So the selection of anchor dimension, how the processing of valid intersection varies. So we will talk more about the properties or options available with anchor and non-anchor dimensions during the demo. So we talked about this a little bit. I'll just skip through this because I will show you these two options within anchor and non-anchor or anchor dimensions. We will go through a quick overview of valid intersections. I know we haven't really started the demo, but once we start that, you will understand this better. But in valid intersections, when you have an anchor dimension, for a selected anchor dimension, when you define a valid intersection along with another dimension, in the slide over here, you have entity, which is your APAC, LATAM, Europe, North America. And then you have another dimension, products, which is your notebooks, tablets, and accessories, and smartphones. So when you define a valid intersection, considering anchor to be the account dimension, then by default, an option which says unselected members are valid is checked, which means that all the members of the anchor dimension are valid, and only the specific valid intersection, those members will be valid with the non-anchor dimension. We will again talk more about this. When you see it, you'll understand it better. This is just a pictorial representation. When you see it in the way it works, it's easier to understand. And I'll come back to this then. And when you uncheck the anchor dimension, when you uncheck the option that unselected members are valid in the anchor dimension, then only the defined valid intersection becomes valid. Everything else in the application or everything else in that cube is invalid. We will talk more about that. And we'll also see an example of conflicts within rules and conflicts in rules between multiple groups. So if you had a conflict within a group, inside a group that is multiple rules defining two different sets of valid intersections which conflict each other, then both the valid intersections will be considered as valid because they are within the same group. So the rules essentially is a union. So what you get, if you think about your set theory, your rule 1 union rule 2 is what is within the group. If you had a conflict between two different groups, then the intersection of those two groups is the valid intersection, and not everything else is considered invalid. And we will talk more about that soon in the demo. Same thing about options for non-anchor dimension. This also we will talk more about when we are doing the demo. It's easier to view these than to read this. So let's move to the demo. Okay, valid intersections can be defined only using the simplified interface. You cannot define them in Excel. So we will be switching between Excel Smart View for the demo itself to look at the results versus the definition of the valid intersection in the web. So it's under applications, you have valid intersections under the application card. There are multiple system-defined valid intersections when you enable certain modules and when you configure the modules. We will not cover those in this demo. We will look at some custom-defined valid intersections, and we'll start with this. So first, let's see what we are even trying to do with a valid intersection. So I have this Smart View ad hoc pull from the system. And over here, you see there's entities across the columns and the accounts in the rows. Sales entities. So in the entity dimension, we have sales entities and the overhead entities. And I've just taken 3 entities here in North America, which are sales, US, IT, and finance. So for a product revenue or a cost of goods sold, only your sales entities usually have product-related revenue or costs. Your overhead entities like IT and finance would have only SGA costs or the operating expenses. So in order to set that, and Gary mentioned this earlier about cross-dimensional security. So you can actually achieve the result of sales US having to enter gross profit and operating expenses, but IT US and finance not having access to gross profit. So you can set that to security easily, where you're saying everyone who belongs in IT or finance do not have access to any accounts that fall under gross profit, but they can enter data against the other expenses or the SGA expenses. But if you had a power user, or if you had a user who had access to the higher level entity, to the parent entity, so let's say North America here, then you do not want the user to enter data for overhead departments against product revenue or cost of goods by mistake. So we can avoid those kind of mistakes or invalid data entry by using valid intersections. Let's look at the first definition, where we are saying all the sales entities can enter gross, any account that falls under gross profit. All other entities or overhead entities can enter data only against the SGA expenses. So let's look at the first example here. So this very simple valid intersection is defined here. All we are saying is account, so all descendants of gross profit, and all the sales entities. So I've selected all the sales entities. So there are 3 sales entities in the dimension here, in entity dimension. So all 3 sales entities can enter gross profit. Now, as you can see here, we talked a little bit about anchor dimension. The first dimension that we select, or the dimension that has this icon next to it, is the anchor dimension. All other dimensions after that are considered non-anchor dimensions. And we'll get to the purpose of an anchor dimension soon. So let's just first look at a simple intersection where we are saying only sales entities can enter gross profit. I'll enable this. So valid intersections can be enabled or disabled very easily. And for them to be applied or processed by the application, you don't have to log off or log back in. You just have to refresh your smart view. And what I just showed you here, all these that you see are groups, are valid intersection groups. Within each group, and a group is where you have the same anchor dimension and the same set of non-anchor dimensions. You can define multiple rules here. So you can do add rule and define multiple rules here. But we are starting with a simple intersection rule. I will enable this. Let's go back to Excel and in Smart View. Now, if I refresh this, we defined an intersection that said any sales entity can enter gross profit and no other entity can enter gross profit. So you're just defining the valid intersections. You are not defining invalid intersections. Those are assumed. So if I refresh here, now if you see the cells over here have changed gray, which is to say that user cannot enter data for gross profit for IT and finance. Whereas for sales, you can enter. So let's just see if we actually can enter any data. Let's just say enter sales, and let's say IT tries to go in and enter some number here to submit data. So if you see, these grayed out cells are read-only, though it does not give a user any error message saying you can't enter the data. The system completely ignores any data that's entered against valid intersections. And data is taken in the valid intersection. So anything that's not a valid intersection, you cannot enter data. But as you can see, Sales US can still enter data for all the SGA expenses, so can IT and finance, which is correct and which is what we want to do. So now let's try to see what this means. So then in the presentation, we looked at we will go back here, and we looked at this where we said in the anchor dimension, unselected members are valid. So that is the default option. Let me go back to the valid intersection definition. And if you click on the anchor dimension, we have a lot of dimensions, so I have to really scroll down, but we'll get to the option. It's displayed in the end. So if you see this here, this is selected by default. The required cannot be changed, so that is grayed out. Because this is selected, which means to say that unselected members are valid. What this means is every member of the account dimension that is not a gross descendant of gross profit is valid with all other dimensions. So that is what that means. So it's valid with all other entities. That means gross profit is valid only with sales entities, but all other accounts are valid with all other entities. And that is what we try to show here. That means everything is valid with everything else, but the specific valid intersection, which means the sales entities are valid only with certain accounts. Now let's go and unselect that option. So what happens when that option is unselected, or we uncheck it, and now it means that it's not enabled. The members that are not over here are not valid anymore. So we'll save and close this. Back in Smart View, refresh, and now if you see, only sales entity has access to the gross profit accounts. All other entities, including sales entity, have lost access to SGA accounts, which is to say that because we unselected our anchor dimension members being valid, that means that now only what you define in your valid intersections will be considered valid. Everything else will be considered invalid. And that is not what we want. So we can go back and change that. But for now, let's just leave that there. So those are that is the option with anchor dimension, where you can either say you will define every possible combination of valid intersections, and you can uncheck that default option. That way, only the ones that you have defined in your valid intersections get applied. Everything else is considered invalid. Or in the case where we are looking at now, where you want, I wanted only sales entities to enter data against gross profit, and everything else can enter data for everything else, all other accounts. This is what we need. Now let's look at another valid intersection where we will see why choosing the right anchor dimension is important. I'll enable this so I don't forget that. And now let's look at the definition. So what I've done here is flipped the account and entity dimension such that now entity dimension is the anchor dimension and the account dimension is the non-anchor dimension. Now what have we defined here? You're saying for entities, the same definition as we saw previously, where your sales entities only sales entities can enter data for gross profit accounts. So we will leave this definition as is, and we will see what happens. I've already enabled it. So we will see what happens when you flip the anchor dimension. In the same query, I will just do a refresh here. And nothing else. Have I enabled it? Yes, I did. Okay. So if you see here, so this did exactly what this was doing. That's why you don't see any difference. So I'll just go back and re-enable this. So you see how let me just set this back to what it was. So we have everything enabled. And now let's enable the entity and account, where entity is the anchor now. back here. Now, if you see, the result is similar to what we did with uncheck, but what this is saying is when you flipped the entity to be the anchor dimension, the definition now says that, let's open that so we can look at that. What this says is sales entities are valid for all for all gross profit accounts. And all other entities are valid with all other accounts, not all other accounts, but with all members of the account dimension. So let me say that again. Sales entities are valid with all the accounts of gross profit, but all the other members of the entity dimension will be valid with all other members of all the dimensions, or all members of all dimensions. And we'll see how that actually, so if I refresh here, I had the option unchecked, that's why it was showing a different result. But now if you see here, you can see that this has opened up the product revenue and cost of goods sold for both finance and IT. That is because what this is saying is I flip the anchor dimension, though the definition is exactly the same, the options are all the same. Flipping the anchor dimension for entity to be the anchor dimension now has changed the definition of what a valid intersection is. So now this says sales is valid with gross profit, but all other entities are now valid with all accounts. And that is why this is the result, which is not what we want. So defining your, figuring out what your anchor dimension is very important. So for our needs, the anchor dimension had to be account, and that serves the purpose. Now I'm going to disable this, and we'll look at a slightly more, we'll add another dimension to the intersection. So let's add product to the intersection. So let's go back to Smart View and say, now we have entity, you have your accounts, you have the entity, and you have products. Now let's say you want, let's say the company, this sales Italy, or Italy as such, Italy entity does business only with smartphones and does not sell any other products. So we will set a valid intersection that says sales Italy is valid with smartphones and no other product. So let's try and look at that. So we'll look at that here. So what we've added another non-anchor dimension, product here. So you have the same definitions that we had earlier, where for gross profit, the sales entities are valid. But what we did is we created another rule here that says gross profit is still valid for sales Italy, but not for all products, only for smartphones. So the other sales entities are valid for any product because North America sells all the products, but sales Italy does only smartphones and nothing else. So now what we are trying to achieve with this is when we try to enter, when Italy entities try to enter data for anything but smartphone, they will only see read-only cells, so they will not be able to enter that data. And let's enable this. Should I enable the right one? And go back here. And so I'm at manufacturing US and smartphone, do a refresh. Because this is manufacturing US is an overhead entity, it does not have access to gross margin, and that is correct. It can only enter SGA expenses, which is still correct. Now let's look at sales US. And as you can see, as expected, sales US can enter data for smartphone. Now let's go to sales Italy, because any entity in Italy can only enter data for smartphones. So when I refresh this, it can enter data for smartphones, so sales Italy and smartphones, all gross margin as well as SGA. Now let's change the product here, something that's not a smartphone. So let's say a tablet. Now if you see, basically cannot enter data or gross profit for a different product. But there's something that we do not want, which is, if you see here now, sales, Italy should not be able to enter any data against a product that is not a smartphone. But you can see here that for expenses, this has been enabled. And that is because of the default selection of the anchor dimension that says, if a member is not defined in the rule, then it is valid, which is going back to this here. Open this again. So over here, the definition is of the valid intersection is for gross profit. The sales entities can enter for either total product or smartphones. That means that, and since we've left everything at default, any account that is not defined here is valid for all other entities and all other products, which is not what we want again, because we do not want any entity in Italy to enter data against a non-smartphone product. So what we will do now is we'll add another valid intersection to say, we will also add operating expenses and say, okay, now sales Italy can not only can enter gross profit as well as expenses only for smartphone. So that is what this says. Now, so what I did is I just went and added the operating expenses or the planning, expense planning parent here. So now all accounts that belong to gross profit as well as expenses for sales Italy will be valid only for smartphones and no other products, because all other accounts are not what we are even looking at in our form here, like statistic accounts and other accounts. So I will save and close this, and let's disable the previous one and enable this new definition where we're saying, okay, now for sales Italy, if it's not a smartphone, then sales Italy should not be able to enter anything. So we'll do a refresh. And this is what we want. If it is not a smartphone, Italy cannot enter any data. Let's go to a smartphone and see if actually it's really working. And yes, Italy is able to enter data for any smartphone product. Okay. Now let's look at the overhead departments. Are the overhead departments still working? So let's try marketing US. We know that overhead departments in the US or in North America have no restriction for any product. Do a refresh. They can't. So marketing US overhead department should be able to enter SGA costs for any product, but it is not able to. And why is that? Let's go back and take a look at this again. So over here, we've defined that expenses are expenses and gross profit. So essentially the entire income statement is valid with sales Canada and US, and is valid with sales Italy. So over here now, the anchor dimension, there is everything else is valid with all other entities, but everything else, expense planning is not everything else. Expense planning should be a valid intersection. So what we will do is add another rule that actually enables the operating expenses for. So over here, what we do here is this remains the same. This remains the same. Add another rule that says operating expenses can be entered by all entities for all products. But again, if you really just even look at it, you know that Italy cannot enter for anything but smartphones. And that's the reason we separate out that into another rule and say, just for Italy, just for descendants of Italy, open up operating expenses only for smartphones. And for sales Italy, open up only for gross profit, open up only sales Italy and for smartphones. And over here, if you see, so there is a conflict here. We will talk about conflict more, but let me just show you this conflict too. If you see here, there's rule 1, rule 2, rule 3, rule 4. There's 4 rules here. In rule 3, we are saying expense planning is valid for descendants of Italy. But again, we are saying here expense planning is not valid for descendants of Italy because that's an exception. So because that is you can add an exception by do an exclusion. You can add an exclusion. So except for descendants of Italy, expense planning is valid for all entities. Now this is a conflict because in one rule I'm saying it's valid, in the other rule I'm saying it's not valid. What this does is, if the moment it is within a group, the moment the system hits a valid intersection, even if another rule within the same group defines something as invalid, it will ignore it. So a valid intersection wins within a group, even if there's a conflict in the rules. And I did this here so only smartphones will have access to Italy and all products will exclude Italy. Now we'll save and close this. I already enabled this. Now let's go and see if Marketing US has access to entering smartphone. So there you go. So now Marketing US can enter only SGA costs and not gross profit. Sales US can enter everything. Italy sales can enter everything for smartphone and nothing for non-smartphone. And Italy overhead can still not enter anything for non-smartphone and can enter overhead for smartphone. So this is what we were trying to achieve. Okay, so I'm now, so that's adding another dimension. So now you're slightly making your valid intersection a little bit more complex. So you will have to break it down into multiple rules.
Krishna, this is RJ here. We're approaching the half hour here.
Yes, I just saw that. Yes.
No, that's all right. There's actually it seems like everyone's sticking around, so you're really covering some good content here. A question did come up through the chat window. Are there any limitations with the types of forms that you're using when it comes to valid intersections? Like, do they apply to maybe ad hoc forms? Just wonder if there's any limitations right now that we're aware of when it comes to applying them to valid intersections to the forms.
Nothing I'm aware of. So a valid intersection works exactly the same in a form or in an ad hoc. And as I showed the first one I showed you was in ad hoc. The second one is a form. So no, there is really no, not that I know of.
Great, thanks.
Okay. Moving on, I'll try to cover this quickly. So we will look at, now we just covered a conflict within a group. Now let's look at what happens when a conflict happens in two different groups. And that is, the deck shows a picture of that, but I won't waste time by going there. We'll just look at that. So I'll enable 2 more rules and we'll look at those 2 rules. So let's look at this rule here. Over here you have 2 rules in this group that says all descendants of North America entity are valid for tablet. And also another rule says all descendants of North America are valid for all smartphones. So what this essentially is doing is, this is a union or an OR operator where both the rules, since tablet is valid with North America and smartphone is valid with North America, both data sets will be valid. So I will not enable the second one. I'll just enable the first one. And let's take a look at what we see. So I've enabled that and we refresh this. You see that smartphones is now valid with ignore the other ones because I've disabled the other valid intersections. But for North America, only smartphones and tablets are valid because we define the valid intersection to say, for North America, only these are valid. For all other entities, everything is valid. Now let's go back and look at the other rule, which is a conflict, which is defining exactly what the other previous rule defined, but only one valid intersection that says descendants of North America are valid only for tablet. Now we will enable this. Now I have two different groups that are saying North America. One group says North America is valid for tablet and smartphones. The second group is saying North America is valid only for a tablet. Now let's see what happens when you enable both. We'll refresh. If you see here, the intersection of both those groups is what becomes valid. Smartphones is no more valid for North America because one group is conflicting with the other group, and when two groups conflict, only the common ones or the intersection set is taken, which is tablet in this case. Okay. I will disable these and we will look at one last one and then we'll be done. So we talked about the options for anchor dimension. Now let's talk about the options for non-anchor dimension. Let's say product. So you have an application, there's multiple cubes in the application. And if a dimension is missing in a cube, by default, what the cube does is, because again, you are not specifying valid intersections for a specific cube, you are defining valid intersections for the entire application. So when there is a dimension that's missing in a cube, what the system does by default is it will ignore the dimension that is not in the cube and it tries and validates the remaining dimensions. So in our example here, we have a cube that does not have the product dimension. So what the system does is it evaluates the account and entity combinations and tries to keep only those as valid intersections. So let's, and what that default option is this required option. Okay, this is unchecked by default. Now let's see how that behaves. I need to enable this before I can show you that. And let's go here and so this is a smart view pull from a cube that is different from all the other cubes that I've been showing you. This does not have the product. If you see here, there is no product anywhere in the dimension list. I'll do a refresh. And you see it's all read-only. It is read-only because the application ignored product dimension and tried to apply the valid intersections to the remaining dimensions, where I do not have entity as a valid intersection, no entity or unspecified entity as a valid intersection. If you come back and look at this, there is a total entity. No entity is not a descendant of total entity, so it's not a valid intersection. And so now my other cubes are impacted by this intersection definition. So what you can do, so the other cubes that don't have a certain dimension are not impacted, is by clicking this required box here. When you check the required box, I know you can see that it's actually checked. You have to go back and verify. So it is checked. Save and close. Now what the application does is, if there is, the moment you say a non-anchor dimension is required, if the application is running a query or a form or anything against that needs to process a valid intersection against a cube that does not have a specific dimension, that valid intersection definition is completely ignored. So now if you see and refresh here, it's all editable because this cube should not be impacted by the product valid and invalid intersections that I define. This cube does not have any of those restrictions. So so you can, for a non-anchor dimension, you can set the default is not required, and you can set it as required so that intersection is ignored by the application. I think that ends the demo. I know we've been over. Thank you for staying on.
Thank you, Krishna, and thank you everybody for staying on the line. Thank you everyone for joining today and for joining any of our previous installments as well. As usual, we will be sharing with you the recording of this webinar next week, and with that, we will also include details about our webinar on sandboxes scheduled for June 26th. Thank you, everybody. Have a good weekend.
Thank you, everyone.